The poster hung crooked on the corkboard one corner, lifting where the tack had missed. Faded ink announced the Millhaven County Fair Tractor Pull Competition in letters meant to look bold, but coming across tired instead. 3 weeks away, August 15th, Warren Mitchell stood in the fluorescent hum of the feed store, reading the same sentences twice, because his mind kept wandering to the barn behind his house, where the 1915 case sat under a tarp thick with dust. Have you ever been the only person who believed in something everyone else had given up on? The question settled in his chest as he touched the poster's edge. 73 years of living had taught him that most questions worth asking didn't have clean answers. The case hadn't run a competitive pull in over a decade. The last time was 2014, back when his knees still bent without complaint, and Linda was alive to tell him he was being foolish. She'd said it with love, the way she said most things, her hand on his shoulder, while he checked the boiler pressure at dawn before that long-ago fair. The feed store smelled like grain dust and motor oil. Behind the counter, a young clerk with a name tag that read Brandon stacked 50-pound bags with the mechanical efficiency of someone whose mind had checked out hours ago. Warren let the poster fall back against the board and moved toward the register with his order slip for chicken feed and fence staples. 80 acres didn't require much these days. He'd sold off 200 more after Linda passed, keeping only what he could manage alone. The money sat in a credit union account, gathering interest he didn't need earmarked in his mind for Rachel, though she'd never asked for it. His daughter had built her own life as a veterinarian 2 counties over, drove a Subaru with clinic decals on the doors, came by every other Sunday with groceries he hadn't requested, and concern that showed in the tightness around her eyes. The bell above the door chimed. Warren glanced back at the poster one more time. Ronald Hayes pushed through carrying a clipboard and the permanent expression of a man who'd organized too many county events to find surprise in anything. 58 heavy-set flannel shirt tucked into jeans that looked ironed. He ran the fair committee the way some men ran churches, with absolute conviction that procedure mattered more than personality. Ron spotted Warren and his eyebrows climbed half an inch. "Warren Mitchell, didn't expect to see you here on a Tuesday. Feed doesn't order itself." "Fair enough." Ron moved to the counter, set the clipboard down, then seemed to notice where Warren's gaze had drifted. "You looking at the pull competition?" "Just reading." "Uh-huh." Ron's tone carried the weight of a man who'd learned to recognize interest disguised as casual observation. "You thinking about entering?" Warren picked up his order slip. Brandon had wandered to the back room. "Might?" "With what?" "The case." Ron's expression cycled through several variations of concern before landing on something between respect and worry. "Warren, that machine's over 100 years old. 111. "Right. And the competition's drawing some serious equipment this year. Blake Harrison signed up last week with his new John Deere. Thing cost more than most houses." The name hung in the air between them. Warren knew the Harrisons by reputation, if not personally. Kenneth Harrison's corporate farm operation had swallowed up 6 family properties in the past 5 years, converting heritage land into industrial acreage with the emotional investment of a man buying stocks. His son, Blake, ran the day-to-day operations. From what Warren heard, though, whether the kid had any real farming in his blood or just his father's money remained an open question. "Deere's a good machine," Warren said. 620 horsepower, good. Computer-managed traction. Dual turbos the works. Ron leaned against the counter. Your case makes what, 45 on a strong day? About that. Warren, I'm not trying to discourage you, but that's not even a fair fight. That's physics being unkind. Brandon returned with Warren's order stacked on a hand truck. Warren signed the receipt and pulled his truck keys from his pocket. Appreciate the concern, Ron. I'll think about it. Outside, July heat pressed down like something physical. Warren loaded the bags into his 1998 Ford pickup, the tailgate protesting with a squeal that had been there since the Clinton administration. The truck had 200,000 miles and counting. He'd replaced the transmission, once the clutch twice, and refused to consider anything newer because this one still started every morning without complaint. The drive back to the farm took 12 minutes through countryside that hadn't changed much in 50 years. Same fence lines, same oak trees marking property corners. Same sense that time moved differently here than in places where people measured their lives in quarters and fiscal years. Warren turned onto the gravel drive that led to his house, a 2-story farmhouse with white paint that needed refreshing and shutters that hung straight through sheer stubbornness. The barn sat beyond weathered wood and a roof he'd patched himself last spring. Inside, under the tarp, the case waited. Warren unloaded the feed, stacked it in the storage shed, then walked across the yard to the barn doors. They rolled open on tracks that squealed despite the grease he applied monthly. Afternoon light slanted through gaps in the siding, illuminating dust motes that swirled like slow snow. He pulled the tarp back. The 1915 Case steam tractor sat exactly where it had been for the past 2 years. Iron wheels with cleats that could punch through frozen ground. A boiler the color of old rust brass fittings gone green with patina, a flywheel big as a dinner table. The machine weighed 9,000 pounds and looked like something that belonged in a museum or a history book, not on a county fair pull lane competing against equipment designed by computers. Warren ran his hand along the boiler's curved surface. The metal held the barn's coolness smooth under his palm, despite decades of weathering. His father, James, had taught him to maintain this machine when Warren was 12 years old, back in 1965, when the Case was already 50 years into its working life. James had received it from his own father, William, who'd bought it new for $2,850 at a time when that sum represented a farmer's courage or foolishness, depending on how the seasons treated him. 3 generations, 1 machine. Warren moved to the rear, inspecting the drive chains and differential housing. Everything looked intact, but looking and running were different animals. He'd need to fire up the boiler check pressure tolerances, verify that seals he'd replaced 2 years ago still held their integrity. The work would take days, maybe a week, if he found issues. His hands knew this machine better than they knew anything else left in his life. Every bolt, every valve, every gauge had a story. The slight scoring on the flywheel from 1983 when a drive belt had sheared mid-pull. The replacement fitting on the water pump from 1997 when the original finally gave out after 82 years. The hand-forged wrench in the toolbox that his father had made in the 1940s for a purpose Warren had never needed to use. He reached for the toolbox mounted behind the boiler, a metal container with a lid that fit so precisely you could hear the seal break when you opened it. Inside, arranged with the care of surgical instruments, lay the tools that had maintained this machine across a century. Wrenches, hammers, punches, a set of files wrapped in oiled cloth. And beneath them, pressed flat against the bottom, A leather journal the size of a man's hand. Warren lifted it out carefully. The cover had darkened with age and oil, the binding cracked, but holding his father's journal. James Mitchell had kept meticulous notes for 40 years, recording every pull, every adjustment, every observation about soil conditions and weather patterns and how the case responded under different loads. Warren had looked through it 100 times over the decades, but familiarity didn't diminish the weight of holding his father's handwriting made permanent in ink. He flipped through pages, sketches of the differential mechanism, tables showing boiler pressure versus ambient temperature, a diagram of soil layers with annotations about moisture retention in clay versus sandy loam. The precision startled him every time, this evidence that his father had approached farming with the rigor of an engineer who happened to work with dirt instead of blueprints. Near the middle, a page marked with a pressed oak leaf, brown and brittle, but somehow intact. Warren turned to it carefully. The entry was dated September 1971. James had lost a pull that day to a newer tractor, written about it with the objectivity of a man analyzing failure to extract lessons. But at the bottom of the page, in different ink, suggesting a later edition, were 2 paragraphs about a technique for reading soil moisture by hand pressure. The writing was smaller, more cramped, as if James had been trying to fit knowledge onto a page already full. Warren had never tried this particular method. His father had shown him the basics of soil reading, but this went deeper, describing how to detect moisture layers 4 or 5 inches below the surface by pressing your full weight into your palm and feeling for temperature variation. The theory made sense. Clay held water longer than topsoil, stayed cooler, transmitted that coolness through soil particles if you pressed hard enough and knew what subtle difference you were seeking. A technique James had used twice, according to the margin note. Once in 1971 after developing it, once in 1989 when conditions matched what he was testing for. Both times it had made the difference between winning and losing. Warren closed the journal and set it back in the toolbox with the reverence due to things that outlast the people who created them. His father had been gone since 1998. 28 years of Warren maintaining this machine alone, making decisions without the counsel that had once come so readily across the barn's workbench. If he entered this competition, he'd be 73 years old on a steam tractor from 1915, facing equipment with more computing power than the Apollo missions. The math didn't favor him. The physics didn't favor him. Common sense suggested he'd be smarter to leave the case under its tarp and spend August like any other month mending fence and rotating chickens and waiting for Rachel's Sunday visits. But something in the way that poster had hung crooked, something in the weight of the journal in his hands, something in the memory of his father's voice saying that a machine this old had lessons left to teach. If you paid attention, all of it settled into a decision that felt less like choice and more like inevitability. He'd enter. He'd prep the case. He'd show up at the fair and probably lose to Blake Harrison's computerized marvel, but he'd do it right the way James had taught him, with attention to detail and respect for what the machine could do when you understood it completely. Warren pulled the tarp back over the case and walked toward the house as evening light stretched shadows across the yard. 15 miles south, in an office with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking 600 acres of Harrison family holdings, Blake Harrison sat across a conference table from his father and tried to remember the last time Kenneth had looked at him without disappointment. The meeting had been going for 90 minutes. Kenneth, 64 years old with silver hair he'd probably paid someone to make look natural, stood at the head of the table using a laser pointer to highlight projected yield charts on a screen that cost more than some families spent on cars. His voice carried the particular confidence of men who'd turned farming into a corporate operation and saw no contradiction in that transformation. These numbers should be higher. Corn futures are up. We've got the equipment, the land's producing. So why are we trailing Kensington Ag by 3%? Blake looked at the charts. The difference Kenneth was highlighting amounted to roughly 40,000 bushels across their total acreage. Real numbers, real money, but hardly the catastrophic shortfall his father's tone suggested. Weather affected the north sections. Late frost in April, then that dry spell in June. We compensated where we could. Compensated. Kenneth set down the pointer. That's the problem right there. We don't compensate. We optimize. We use technology to eliminate variables, not react to them. Blake had heard variations of this speech since returning from agricultural engineering school 8 years ago. His degree hung framed in his apartment, proof that he understood the science of modern farming, that he could discuss soil chemistry and precision agriculture and GPS-guided planting with the vocabulary of someone educated beyond simple competence. But Kenneth had a way of making education feel inadequate compared to the raw force of capital and will. What nobody in this room knew, what Blake had never spoken aloud to anyone, including the handful of people he might call friends, was that he'd spent 31 years trying to earn a look from his father that never came. The look that said he was good enough, that he measured up, that he'd proven himself as something more than Kenneth's son, with Kenneth's money, making Kenneth's decisions, with Kenneth's equipment on Kenneth's land. Every season was another attempt. Every yield increase, every efficiency improvement, every purchase of newer technology, all of it aimed at a target that moved just fast enough to stay out of reach. Kenneth pulled up another slide. Photos of equipment from a trade show last month. Combines with artificial intelligence planters that adjusted seed depth in real time based on soil sensors. Tractors that drove themselves with precision measured in centimeters. This is what Kensington's investing in. This is why they're beating us. Kenneth tapped the screen. We need to think bigger. Blake's phone vibrated against the table. He glanced down at a notification from the Millhaven County Fair website confirming his registration for the tractor pull competition in 3 weeks. He'd signed up yesterday on impulse, or what felt like impulse, but might have been something closer to desperation. Kenneth noticed something more important than this meeting. Fair registration. I entered the tractor pull. The what? County Fair. They have a tractor pull competition. I registered. Kenneth's expression cycled through confusion towards something that might have been amusement if it held any warmth. You're entering a county fair competition. Yes? With what, the new Deere? That was the plan. And the point of this is what exactly? Publicity? Community relations. Blake didn't have an answer that would satisfy his father because the truth was too complicated and too personal. The truth was, he'd seen the poster at the feed store and felt something shift in his chest, a sense that maybe here was a venue where skill mattered more than corporate strategy, where he could prove something to himself, if not to Kenneth. But saying that out loud would sound weak, and weakness in Kenneth's presence got ground down like everything else that didn't serve immediate practical purposes. Marketing, Blake said, which was close enough to plausible. Kenneth checked his watch, a Swiss piece that probably cost more than the average Millhaven County resident made in 3 months. Fine. Win it. Put the Harrison name on something visible. He gathered his papers. But don't let it distract from actual work. We've got harvest planning starting next week, and I want those yield projections revised upward by Monday. The meeting ended the way most meetings with Kenneth ended, with Blake feeling simultaneously dismissed and burdened with expectations that contradicted each other. Win the poll, but don't get distracted. Improve yields, but don't blame weather. Be independent, but follow directives. Blake stayed in the conference room after Kenneth left, looking out the windows at acreage that stretched to the horizon. 600 acres that his family had accumulated through purchases so recent that older residents still referred to these parcels by the names of families who'd sold them. The Brennan Place, the old Kowalski Farm, the Patterson homestead that Ed Dawson had worked for 60 years before finally accepting Kenneth's offer. Blake's education had taught him to see this land as a production asset. Input costs versus output, yields measured in bushels per acre, and return on investment. But sometimes, usually late at night, when the numbers blurred together into meaninglessness, he wondered if something got lost in that translation from soil to spreadsheet. His phone buzzed again, a text from Cody Thompson, the 19-year-old he'd hired last month to help with equipment maintenance and general labor. The kid was reliable, showed up on time, asked good questions. Blake had been impressed enough to trust him with minor repairs and daily operational tasks. Mr. Harrison, the Deere's ready for whatever you need. Ran diagnostics. Everything's green. Let me know about the fair prep. Blake typed back a response confirming they'd start preparation next week, then pocketed his phone and headed for his truck. The John Deere 9RX sat in the equipment barn, all 620 horses and $475,000 of it, gleaming under LED shop lights like something from a future that had already arrived. He'd purchased it 6 months ago with Kenneth's reluctant approval. The reluctance rooted not in the cost, but in Kenneth's suspicion that Blake wanted the machine more for its own sake than for practical farming purposes. The suspicion wasn't entirely wrong. Blake loved that Deere the way some men loved classic cars or fine watches, appreciated its engineering with an enthusiasm that felt purer than anything else in his professional life. But love didn't win pull competitions. Power did. Technology did. And Blake had both in abundance. What he didn't have, what the education and equipment couldn't provide, was the certainty that any of this mattered beyond the quarterly reports Kenneth studied like scripture. He drove home as sunset turned the Missouri sky, orange and purple colors that looked computer-generated in their intensity. His apartment occupied the top floor of a converted grain elevator, all exposed brick and industrial windows, decorated with furniture he'd picked from catalogs because he had money, but no particular sense of what home was supposed to feel like. The folder with the fair competition details sat on his kitchen counter. He'd printed everything, studied the rules, mapped out the logistics. Best of 3 rounds, 80 feet of chain between machines. First to pull the other past center by 10 feet won that round. Blake flipped through the registration list. 12 entries total. Most were farmers he recognized by name, if not personally. Men running operations that predated corporate agriculture by generations. And there, third from the bottom, Warren Mitchell, 1915 Case steam tractor. Blake stared at the entry. A steam tractor, an actual antique. He pulled up specifications on his laptop, found historical data on the Case models from that era. 45 horsepower, maybe 60 at absolute peak. Iron wheels, manual controls, no computers, no sensors, nothing that would qualify as modern technology by any definition created after 1950. His first reaction was amusement. His second, arriving close behind, was something closer to curiosity. What kind of person entered a competition knowing they were outmatched by a factor of 10 or more? Foolishness, nostalgia, or maybe something Blake didn't have a name for something his education hadn't covered. He closed the laptop and looked out the window at the grain silos that dominated Millhaven's skyline. 3 weeks until the fair. 3 weeks to prepare the Deere. 3 weeks to make sure everything ran perfectly. 3 weeks to prove to Kenneth that he could win something, anything, even if it was just a county fair trophy that would sit on a shelf and mean nothing to anyone except Blake himself. Tuesday afternoon, Rachel Mitchell pulled her Subaru into her father's driveway and immediately noticed the barn doors standing open. Warren didn't leave them open. He was meticulous about securing things, had been for as long as she could remember, that Depression-era frugality that treated every resource like it might be the last one you'd get. She grabbed the grocery bags from the passenger seat and headed for the house. The screen door needed replacing. She'd been telling him that for 2 years, but Warren had a relationship with objects that involved maintaining them far past the point where replacement made more sense. The hinges creaked their familiar complaint as she pushed through. "Dad." No answer. Rachel set the bags on the kitchen counter, unpacked perishables into a refrigerator that hummed with concerning irregularity, then headed back outside toward the barn. She found Warren kneeling beside the case, a wrench in his hand and grease smeared across his forearm. The tarp lay folded in the corner with the precision of origami. Afternoon light made the brass fittings glow. "You're running it again." Warren looked up. His face carried that expression of mild surprise he always wore when she arrived, as if her visits remained unexpected despite their bi-weekly regularity. "Just checking things over." "Dad, this isn't a casual check. You've got tools out. You're in assessment mode." Rachel had spent enough time watching her father work to recognize the difference between routine maintenance and preparation for something larger. "What's going on?" Warren stood, joints protesting audibly. "There's a tractor pull competition at the fair. Thinking about entering." Rachel felt something cold settle in her stomach. With this, that was the idea. "Dad, this machine is 111 years old. When's the last time it ran a competition?" 2014 June Fair. Took second place." "That was 12 years ago. You were 61. You're 73 now." Warren wiped his hands on a shop rag, his movements deliberate. "Math still works fine, honey." "I'm not questioning your math. I'm questioning your judgment." Rachel moved closer to the case, seeing it with fresh eyes. The machine looked simultaneously solid and fragile iron that had survived a century, but might not survive one more hard pull. "What happens if something breaks, if the boiler cracks under pressure?" "It won't. You can't know that." "I can." Warren's voice carried quiet certainty. "I've maintained this machine since I was 12 years old. I know every weld, every seal, every stress point. Your grandfather taught me, and his father taught him. This case has been pulling load since 1915. She's got more pulls left in her." Rachel wanted to argue, but recognized the futility. Her father had a stubbornness that presented as patience, a willingness to absorb objections without changing course that drove her to distraction. She'd seen it during her mother's illness, Warren's insistence on maintaining routines and schedules, even as Linda declined his conviction that consistency mattered when everything else was falling apart. Why now? Why this competition? Warren looked at the case for a long moment before answering. Because I can still do it. Because the machine deserves better than gathering dust. Because your grandfather taught me things that matter, and I'd like to prove they still do. The honesty caught Rachel off guard. Her father rarely explained motivations. This clearly preferred to let actions speak without accompanying interpretation. You don't have anything to prove. Not to anyone else, maybe. They stood in silence, the kind that fills with everything you're not saying. Rachel understood her father well enough to know that arguing further would accomplish nothing except creating distance neither of them wanted. But understanding didn't eliminate the fear that tightened her chest when she imagined him on that machine, pushing it hard in front of a crowd, risking injury or humiliation or both. At least let me be there. When you run it, don't do this alone. I'll be fine. Dad, I'm not asking permission. I'm telling you, I'll be there. Warren nodded acceptance that required no further discussion. He picked up another wrench and returned to examining the differential housing. Rachel watched him work, seeing in his movements the accumulated knowledge of 6 decades spent maintaining this machine. His hands moved with unconscious precision, finding bolt heads without applying exactly the right amount of torque. It struck her, not for the first time, but with fresh force, that when her father was gone, this knowledge would vanish with him. She didn't know how to maintain a steam tractor, wouldn't know which valve did what, which seal needed replacement on what schedule, how to read boiler pressure, or adjust the regulator, or any of the 1,000 small competencies that Warren carried like second nature. "Teach me," she said. Warren paused mid-turn. "What?" "Teach me about the case, how it works, what you do to keep it running." "Rachel, you've got your own work. The clinic keeps you busy enough." "I'm asking anyway. Maybe I won't remember everything, but at least I'll understand what you're doing, why this matters so much." Warren set down the wrench and looked at his daughter with an expression Rachel couldn't quite read. Pride, maybe, or sadness, or both mixed together in the complicated way emotions blend when you're watching generations shift. "All right, we'll start with the basics. See that valve there? The one with the red tape?" They spent the next hour with Warren explaining systems and Rachel asking questions, both of them aware they were doing something larger than a simple mechanical lesson. Outside, the afternoon aged toward evening. Neither of them mentioned the competition again, but it hung there between them like a promise neither was ready to examine too closely. Edward Dawson's truck rattled into the driveway Thursday morning while Warren was filling the case's water reservoir. The pickup was older than Rachel's, but better maintained, dark blue paint kept waxed, and an engine Ed serviced with the attention most people reserved for family members. 81 years old, and the man still drove like someone who expected to need his truck for another decade. Ed climbed out slowly, the kind of slow that came from joints that remembered every hard winter since Eisenhower. He'd sold his farm to Kenneth Harrison 10 years back, a decision that still sat poorly if you mentioned it at the wrong time. But he'd extracted enough money to live comfortably and kept enough dignity intact to hold his head up around town. "Heard you were getting her ready." Warren shut off the water. "News travels. This county's got about 3 secrets total, and none of them are interesting." Ed walked to the case, ran his hand along the boiler the way you'd greet an old friend. "Your daddy would be pleased. Or think I'm crazy?" James was never one to judge crazy. Man bought a steam tractor in 1965 when everyone else was going diesel. Ed circled the machine inspection that looked casual but wasn't. "Seals holding. Replaced them 2 years ago. Tested pressure yesterday. Everything's solid. Differential. Original mechanism. Needs cleaning, but it's functional. Ed crouched by the rear axle, knees cracking like kindling. He studied the differential housing with the focus of someone reading text only he could see. "You planning to lock it?" The question carried weight beyond its simple words. Warren had been thinking about the differential lock since finding his father's journal, that hand-forged wrench sitting in the toolbox like a solution to a problem he hadn't faced yet. "Depends on conditions." "Uh-huh." Ed stood wiping dust from his hands. "James locked it twice that I know of. Once in '71 when the ground was hard-packed dry. Once in '89 after 3 days of rain when everything was slip. I remember the '89 pull. You were there, helped him prep, watched from the fence." Ed nodded slowly, memory and present mixing, in the way they did for men who'd lived long enough to see patterns repeat. He won both times, not because the case was stronger, because he understood what the lock would do against certain ground conditions. Rubber stays on top, spreads the weight. Iron punches through. Ed pointed at the cleats on the rear wheels. "These'll bite into layers rubber can't reach, but only if you know where those layers are." Warren felt the weight of knowledge, being passed, lessons his father had learned and shared with Ed, now coming back through a different mouth, but carrying the same truth. The journal talks about reading soil moisture by hand. Does it now? Ed's expression suggested this wasn't news. James worked on that technique for years. Pressure sensitivity in your palm, feeling for temperature variation below the surface. Sounds like pseudoscience until you've watched it work. Did it work? Saw him call soil moisture depth to within half an inch just by pressing his hand flat for 30 seconds. Farmers with soil probes came close, but not closer. Ed walked to the barn entrance, looked out at Warren's acreage. Different kind of knowledge than what they teach in schools now. Not better or worse necessarily, just different. They stood quiet for a stretch, letting the morning settle. Birds worked the fence line. Somewhere distant, a dog barked twice and quit. "You're going up against Blake Harrison," Ed said finally. "I know. Kenneth's boy got himself that big Deere. Computer-managed traction, all the modern advantages. 620 horsepower. Against your 45. Ed turned back. "You understand, the math doesn't favor you." "I do." "Good, because this isn't about math. Never has been." Ed moved to his truck, pulled the door open, then paused. "James used to say the machine listens to the ground better than the man does. Your job's not to force things. It's to pay attention when the machine tries to tell you something." Ed drove off, leaving Warren with the case and thoughts that circled without landing. 3 weeks until the fair. 3 weeks to prepare a machine that was running before the Panama Canal opened, before World War I, before anyone imagined computers or GPS or the kind of farming Blake Harrison practiced. Warren spent the rest of the day going through systems, boiler tubes, clean water pump, functional drive chains, properly tensioned. He fired up the boiler late afternoon, brought pressure up slowly, watching gauges that his grandfather had read first. The needle climbed 80 psi, 100, 120. He held it there for 15 minutes, listening to the steady rhythm of steam release, the particular hiss that meant everything was sealed tight. At 130 psi, the pressure valve lifted with its characteristic whistle. Warren eased the regulator down, brought the pressure back to 120, and held it steady. The machine idled with the deep, mechanical breathing of something alive, metal and fire and water working together in the balance men had figured out a century before anyone thought to complicate it with electronics. He shut it down as evening approached. Let the boiler cool naturally, checked for leaks he didn't find. The case sat in the barn's dimness, iron and brass, catching the last light, looking like exactly what it was, old technology that still functioned if you understood it completely. Warren locked the barn and headed for the house, thinking about Blake Harrison and his $250,000 Deere, about math that didn't favor him and knowledge that couldn't be purchased. 3 weeks felt simultaneously too long and not nearly enough. Friday morning, August 14th. Warren woke at 4:30 without an alarm. The habit of decades meant his body knew when to rise, regardless of what the calendar demanded. He dressed, made coffee in a percolator Linda had bought in 1982, stood at the kitchen window, watching darkness thin toward dawn. Today, he'd drive the case to the fairgrounds, load it onto the flatbed, transported it the 12 miles, position it for tomorrow's competition. Simple logistics made complicated by equipment age and the awareness that this might be the last time the machine left his property under its own power. The flatbed trailer sat behind the barn where he'd stored it after the 2014 pull. Warren had greased the bearings last week, checked tire pressure, verified the ramps would support 9,000 pounds without complaint. Everything looked solid, but 60-year-old equipment had a way of surprising you. He finished the coffee, rinsed the cup, headed outside into pre-dawn cool that wouldn't survive past 8 o'clock. Inside the barn, he fired up the case, brought pressure to operating range, drove it slowly out into the yard. The iron wheels turned with their distinctive grinding sound, cleats biting into gravel. Backing onto the trailer required precision Warren had practiced enough times to make automatic. Line up the approach, ease forward until the rear wheels touch the ramps, feel for the angle. The case climbed slowly, weight settling onto the trailer's frame with creaks that stayed just shy of alarming. Warren chained it down with the thoroughness of someone who'd seen equipment shift during transport and knew the cost. 4 chains, all tensioned properly, all secured to frame points designed to handle load stress. By 6 o'clock, he was ready. Rachel's Subaru pulled in as Warren was doing final checks. "You left at 4, she said, climbing out. "Wanted to get an early start." "Dad, the fair doesn't open until 9. "I know, but I open when I open." Rachel smiled, despite herself. "You want company on the drive?" Warren considered. Part of him preferred doing this alone, maintaining the routine he'd established over decades of showing up early and working without audience. But another part, the one that heard his daughter asking questions about the case and saw her trying to understand what this meant, recognized the offer for what it was. "Sure, you can follow in your car. Meet me there." "I'll drive with you. Leave my car here." They climbed into the truck, Warren behind the wheel, Rachel in the passenger seat she'd occupied on countless trips when she was young. The engine turned over, diesel rumbling to life. Warren eased down the driveway, pulling the trailer, careful on the turns, watching the mirrors to make sure the case stayed stable. The drive to Millhaven Fairgrounds took them through country roads that barely qualified as county maintained, past the Brennan place that Kenneth Harrison now owned, past the old Kowalski farm, also Harrison property, past fence lines that had marked boundaries for a century and might mark them for another if corporate agriculture didn't redraw the map entirely. "You nervous?" Rachel asked. "Not nervous. Aware." "Of what?" "That I'm 73 pulling against people half my age with equipment twice as powerful." But you're doing it anyway. Seems that way. Rachel looked out the window at fields turning gold with approaching harvest. Mom would have thoughts about this. She always had thoughts. She'd probably tell you you're being stubborn and foolish, and she'd be at the fairgrounds tomorrow cheering anyway. Warren felt the truth of that settle. Linda had possessed the rare ability to criticize and support simultaneously, to question his decisions while standing beside him when he made them anyway. 5 years gone, and he still reached for her opinion on things that mattered. She'd be right on both counts, Warren said. They arrived at the fairgrounds at 6:45. The gates stood open, vendors setting up, carnival workers assembling rides that looked questionable even in good light. Warren drove to the pull lane area where Ron Hayes stood with a clipboard, looking exactly as prepared as a man who'd organized this event for 17 years should look. Ron waved them toward a designated spot. Warren Mitchell, right on schedule, which means early. Habit. Uh-huh. Back it in next to the marking stakes. We'll measure chain length when everyone's here. Warren positioned the trailer, unloaded the case with the same careful attention he'd used loading it. The machine rolled down the ramps and onto fairground dirt with the authority of something that belonged. He parked it in the assigned space, killed the boiler, stepped back to assess. In the early morning light, away from his barn and on the pull lane where it would compete, the case looked simultaneously magnificent and absurd. Magnificent in the way old machinery holds beauty through pure function. Absurd because 3 spots down sat Blake Harrison's John Deere 9RX, already unloaded, gleaming green paint, catching sun that was just clearing the horizon. Rachel stood beside Warren, following his gaze. That's the competition, part of it. They walked closer. The Deere sat like something from a different century, which technically it was. Cab with climate control and touchscreen displays. Tires taller than Warren. Exhaust stack that suggested the kind of power his case would need a month to accumulate. A young kid, maybe 19, was wiping dust from the hood with a microfiber cloth. "You're Cody Thompson," Rachel said. The kid looked up, startled. "Yes, ma'am. Do I know you?" "No, but I know your family. Treated your grandfather's cattle dogs last year." "Oh, right. Doc Mitchell." "Rachel's fine." She glanced at the Deere. "This is impressive equipment." "Yes, ma'am. Mr. Harrison takes real good care of it." Warren stepped forward, extending his hand. "Warren Mitchell. I'm running the case over there." Cody shook his grip, firm but not performative. "Sir, that's a beautiful machine. My great-grandfather used to talk about the old steam tractors. They're still running if you maintain them right." "I believe it." Cody looked between Warren and the case with genuine interest. "You mind if I come look at it closer? Never seen one in person." "Any time you want." A truck pulled in, expensive enough to announce itself. Blake Harrison climbed out wearing jeans that looked new and work boots that had seen actual work. 31 years old, medium build, the kind of face that suggested competence without any particular distinguishing features. He walked with the practiced confidence of someone used to operating expensive equipment. Blake noticed them near his Deere-altered course. "Morning." "Mr. Harrison," Cody said. Blake nodded, then looked at Warren. "You must be Warren Mitchell. Saw your entry, the 1915 case." "That's right." They shook hands, the ritual of competitors acknowledging each other before conflict. "That's remarkable equipment. My grandfather used to talk about machines like that. They last if you treat them right." "I imagine they do." Blake glanced at the case, then back at Warren. "Looking forward to the competition. Should be interesting." The words carried no malice, but no particular warmth either. professional courtesy from someone confident in their advantages. Warren recognized the tone, had heard it before from younger farmers who'd grown up with technology and saw older methods as curiosities rather than threats. Same, Warren said. Blake headed toward the registration tent with the clipboard Ron was holding. Warren and Rachel walked back to the case. Around them, the fairground was filling with activity. More trucks arriving, more machines being positioned. The crowd that would gather tomorrow numbered in the hundreds, if past years held. People from across the county and beyond, drawn by the spectacle of power against power, modern against traditional, the kind of competition that had no stakes beyond pride and the temporary glory of a trophy nobody would remember in a month. Except Warren would remember. And something about the way Blake had looked at the case, that mixture of respect and dismissal, suggested he might remember too. "You ready for this?" Rachel asked. Warren looked at the 1915 case sitting on fairground, dirt iron and brass, and a century of pulls behind it. He thought about his father James and grandfather William, about knowledge passed through generations, about the journal in the toolbox, and the red valve he'd never needed to open. As ready as I'll be. The sun climbed higher, the fairground filled with sound and motion. Tomorrow, the chain would stretch between machines, the flag would drop, and Warren Mitchell would discover whether old knowledge mattered against new power, whether understanding compensated for horsepower, whether any of this meant what he hoped it might. He spent the rest of the morning checking systems one final time, aware that after tomorrow the answer would be waiting. Saturday morning arrived with heat already pressing down by 7 o'clock. Warren stood beside the case running final checks while the fairground transformed around him. Families streamed through gates, children dragging parents toward carnival rides that spun and screamed. Food vendors fired up grills, releasing smoke that smelled of sausage and funnel cake. The Ferris wheel turned slowly in test mode, empty seats swaying. The pull lane had been roped off since dawn. Ron Hayes supervised setup with the methodical attention of someone who'd measured chain lengths and marked center lines too many times to tolerate imprecision. 80 feet of heavy iron links lay coiled near the flagpole. White paint marked the neutral zone on dirt that had been graded smooth yesterday afternoon. Blake's Deere sat 3 positions down, Cody polishing chrome that didn't need polishing. The machine looked as if it had rolled off the showroom floor that morning, every surface gleaming, not a speck of dust visible anywhere. Warren's case carried the patina of use brass fittings, gone green iron, darkened by a century of weather. Both machines drew spectators, but the crowds clustered differently. Parents lifted children to touch the Deere's massive tires while explaining horsepower in voices meant to impress. Older men gathered around the case, speaking quietly, some of them remembering machines like this from childhood. Rachel appeared carrying 2 cups of coffee in paper cups that burned her fingers. "Crowd's bigger than I expected." Warren accepted the coffee. "County fair's the biggest thing that happens here all year." "Still, there must be 300 people already." More kept arriving. Trucks filled the overflow parking lot. Families claimed spots along the fence, spreading blankets and setting up chairs. Someone had brought binoculars, though the pull lane was maybe 40 yards at its farthest point. The anticipation built with numbers, that particular energy, when people gathered to watch something happen that couldn't be predicted with certainty. Ron's voice cut through the noise via megaphone, tinny and overloud. "Competitors to the registration tent. Final briefing in 10 minutes." Warren set down his coffee and headed across the fairground. Blake walked from the opposite direction, Cody trailing behind with a clipboard. They converged at the tent where Ron stood with papers spread across a folding table. "Gentlemen, 12 entries total. We'll run brackets. Mitchell and Harrison, you're positioned for first match based on registration order." Ron traced a finger down the bracket sheet. "Best of 3 rounds. 80 feet of chain center marker, 10 feet past neutral wins the round. 2 rounds takes the match." Blake studied the bracket. "When do we start?" 9:30. Gives the crowd time to settle." Ron looked at Warren. "You need anything water for the boiler, extra time to bring up pressure." "I'm ready when you are." Ron nodded and moved on to brief the other competitors. Warren walked back to the case alone, aware of eyes tracking him. The oldest man in the competition by 2 decades, running equipment that predated most of the crowd's grandparents. The mathematics of improbability surrounded him like weather. Ed Dawson had positioned himself near the case, leaning against the rope barrier with the patience of someone who'd learned to conserve energy for what mattered. "Pressure good." Warren climbed onto the iron seat. "Holding at 125. I'll bring it up to 130 before the pull. Don't push too hard first round. Feel him out. See how that Deere handles under load." "Planning on it." Ed's hand rested on the case's boiler, a gesture of familiarity, or blessing, or both. "Your daddy ran this machine in 17 competitions. 112, lost 5. Every loss taught him something the wins couldn't." Warren adjusted the regulator slightly, watching the pressure needle hold steady. "What did he learn from losing?" "That power is only part of it. Rest is timing and understanding what the ground wants to give you." The crowd had swelled to 500 easy, bodies pressed against the rope barriers, 3 deep in places. Children sat on parents' shoulders. Someone had set up a video camera on a tripod, the kind of documentation that would end up on local news or social media, preserving this moment, whether Warren wanted preservation or not. Blake climbed into the Deere's cab. Through the tinted glass, Warren could see him running through startup sequences, hands moving across controls with practiced efficiency. The engine note changed when Blake fired it up, a deep rumble that carried bass you felt in your sternum from 30 yards away. Exhaust trickled from the vertical stack, black smoke dissipating into morning air. Warren opened the case's steam regulator 2 degrees. Pressure climbed toward 130. The flywheel spun faster, drive chains tightening as mechanical advantage built. No computer monitored these systems, no sensors adjusted parameters in real time, just iron and steam and the accumulated knowledge of how much pressure the boiler could hold before seams started complaining. Ron's crew connected the chain between the 2 machines, 80 feet of links thick as a man's wrist, each one forged decades ago for purposes exactly like this. The chain lay in the dirt between Warren and Blake, a line drawn between centuries. Rachel stood at the fence, her face carrying worry she was trying to hide behind professional composure. Warren caught her eye and nodded once. She nodded back, the communication of people who'd run out of words that would change anything. Ron walked to the center marker, carrying a flag and his megaphone. First match, Warren Mitchell on a 1915 Case steam tractor against Blake Harrison on a 2024 John Deere 9RX. Best of 3 rounds. First machine to pull the opponent 10 feet past center takes that round. The crowd noise dropped to murmurs. Parents shushed children. Even the carnival rides seemed to quiet, though they kept spinning in the distance. Ron raised the flag. Right then you had to wonder, does experience mean anything when the newer machine has 10 times the power? Or is there something sensors can't read? The flag dropped. Blake's response came immediately, smooth throttle application, that sent power through the Deere's drivetrain without drama. The traction control system distributed torque across both rear wheels' computer processors, making thousands of micro-adjustments per second to maximize grip. The chain snapped tight with a sound like a gunshot. Warren felt the case lurch backward before he'd even touched the regulator. The iron wheels turned against his wheel cleats, digging shallow furrows as 9,000 pounds of machine started moving the wrong direction. 1 foot, 2 feet. The crowd on Blake's side erupted in noise. Warren opened the regulator with the deliberate precision of someone who'd done this exact movement 10,000 times. Steam flooded into the cylinder. The flywheel accelerated. Drive chains pulled taut with force that transmitted through the iron frame into the seat where Warren sat, feeling every vibration. The backward movement slowed. 3 feet from the center line, the case's wheels bit harder into packed earth. Warren increased pressure another degree, watching the boiler gauge climb toward 135. The backward slide stopped at 4 feet. Both machines locked in equilibrium. The chain between them vibrated like something alive, tension making the iron links sing a note just below human hearing. Blake's engine maintained steady power, computer managing fuel mixture, and boost pressure. Warren held the regulator at a precise angle, letting steam do what steam did best when you understood its nature completely. 30 seconds passed. Neither machine moved an inch in either direction. The crowd had gone absolutely silent, watching something nobody had expected to see. The case was holding. Against 620 horsepower and modern engineering, the antique was holding position like it had every right to be there. Blake eased back on the throttle slightly. Warren decreased pressure by a fraction. The chain went slack. Ron stepped forward with his measuring tape, checked positions relative to the center marker. He straightened up and raised both hands flat. Round 1, no winner. Stalemate. The silence broke into noise twice as loud as before. People who'd come to watch the old machine lose with dignity were processing something that didn't fit their expectations. Blake sat in the Deere's cab, looking through the windshield at the case, his expression unreadable through tinted glass. Warren eased the pressure down to 120 and let the boiler settle. His hands were steady, but his heart was working harder than it should. The effort of holding position against that much power had required every bit of focus he possessed, every lesson James had taught him about managing steam pressure at the edge of tolerance. Rachel was gripping the fence rail with both hands, knuckles white. Ed caught Warren's eye and made a small gesture, thumb up, barely visible. Kenneth Harrison stood in the VIP section with his phone pressed to his ear, not even watching what his son had just accomplished. The 15-minute break between rounds felt simultaneously too long and not nearly enough. Warren climbed down from the case to check systems. Everything looked solid, but running at peak pressure, stressed components made metal flex in ways that accumulated over time into fatigue. Blake's crew had formed a huddle near the Deere. Cody held a tablet showing diagnostic readouts. Blake stood with arms crossed, listening while his mechanic pointed at numbers and made suggestions Warren couldn't hear. Ed walked over once the crew dispersed. He's going to adjust something. Saw them working on tire pressure. Warren looked toward the Deere. Sure enough, Blake was at the rear tires with a pressure gauge and compressor hose. Adding or releasing, adding, maybe 8-10 psi, trying to get more bite. Warren considered the implications. Higher tire pressure meant a smaller contact patch, but greater pressure per square inch against the ground. On hard-packed soil that might work. On anything with give, it could backfire, reducing the total friction surface. Rachel appeared with water bottles, thrust one at Warren. "Dad, you don't have to prove anything. You held him to a draw. Round's not over. I mean it. Nobody expected you to hold it all. You've already shown what the case can do." Warren drank half the bottled water that tasted like plastic and chlorine. "2 more rounds. And if the boiler—" "It won't." Rachel started to say something else, but stopped, recognizing the futility. She walked back to the fence, and Warren returned to checking the case's systems with hands that moved through familiar motions while his mind worked through scenarios. Blake was smart. The tire pressure adjustment meant he'd analyzed what happened in round 1 and adapted his strategy. The Deere's traction control was sophisticated enough to compensate for changing conditions, but the base physics still mattered. More pressure, less surface area, concentrated force. Warren climbed back onto the iron seat. He brought pressure up slowly, watching the gauge climb to 130. The boiler responded with its characteristic hiss, steam escaping through the relief valve in measured rhythm. Everything felt solid, but he was aware, more aware than he'd been during round 1, that this machine was operating at tolerances its designers had built in over a century ago, when safety margins were generous because failure could mean death. Ron's megaphone crackled. "Round 2! Competitors ready." Blake's engine note deepened as he brought the Deere to full idle. The traction control system ran through its calibration sequence, tiny adjustments to torque distribution that happened too fast for human perception. Warren held the regulator at 130 psi and waited. Ron raised the flag. The crowd leaned forward as one 500 people holding collective breath. The flag fell. Blake engaged with precision, this time not raw power, but managed electronic force. The traction control read ground resistance in real-time distributed torque to where grip was strongest. The chain tightened and the case moved backward immediately, 1 foot before Warren could react. He opened the regulator hard, pushing pressure toward 140. The boiler responded with increased steam flow, but the wheels were already turning iron cleats, fighting for purchase on ground that had been worked smooth by the first pull. 2 feet back, 3 feet. Warren pushed the pressure higher, watching the needle approach 145. This was the upper edge of the safe range, the boundary James had marked in the journal with a note about seam stress. The flywheel spun faster chains, transmitting force that made the whole frame vibrate. The backward movement slowed, but didn't stop. 4 feet from center. The soil here was drier than the first pull spot, hard-packed from weeks without rain. Blake's tire pressure adjustment was working exactly as intended. The rubber gripped hard, found purchase pulled with the relentless force of 600 horsepower managed by computers. 5 feet back, the center marker crossed into Blake's territory. Warren held pressure at 145, as high as he dared push without risking real damage. But the ground wasn't cooperating, wasn't giving the iron cleats anything to grab except more hard pack. Physics was doing Blake's work, modern engineering, proving why it had replaced old methods. The marker moved 6 feet past neutral. 7 feet. Ron raised his hand toward Blake's side. "Round 2? Harrison!" Blake's supporters erupted. Someone near the back fence cupped hands around their mouth. "Send that museum piece home." A few people laughed. Blake allowed himself a small smile, visible through the Deere's windshield, raised one finger toward Cody. 1 round left, 1 round to finish this. Warren brought the pressure down gradually, feeling the boiler settle back toward sustainable levels. His shirt was soaked through with sweat, despite the morning hour. The iron seat felt hot enough to cook eggs. Around him, the crowd's energy had shifted, vindication setting in for people who'd expected modern equipment to dominate from the start. But Warren wasn't looking at the crowd. He was looking at the pull lane, at where round 3 would happen, the southeast corner that Ed had mentioned yesterday. Different soil there, closer to the drainage line where water collected during rains. The hardpack wouldn't extend that far. He climbed down from the case, movements stiff. Rachel met him with concern that had moved past worry into something closer to fear. "Dad, please. You tried. Nobody can say you didn't try." Warren didn't answer. He walked past her toward the back edge of the pull lane, past the markers and rope barriers, to where the ground transitioned from work dirt to natural soil. Knelt down in dust and pressed his right hand flat against the earth. The surface was hot, baked by morning sun. Warren pressed harder, letting his full weight settle into his palm. 2 inches down, the temperature dropped slightly. He moved his hand 6 inches left and pressed again, reading texture through skin that had learned decades ago how to interpret what dirt was saying if you paid attention. The top layer was dry, just like the spot where Blake had won round 2. But underneath, maybe 4 inches down, the soil felt different, cooler. The rain from 4 days ago had percolated through topsoil and settled in the clay layer beneath. Clay held moisture, kept it locked away from surface evaporation. Warren pressed in 3 more spots, building a mental map of moisture distribution. The 1968 memory came unbidden, sharp as broken glass. 15 years old, out in the west field with James on an October morning, so clear you could see individual leaves on trees a mile distant. James kneeling in harvested cornfield stubble, demonstrating the hand pressure technique he'd developed through trial and error. Soil talks if you listen. Top layer lies because that's what the sun touches. But deeper down, that's where truth lives. You want to know what's really happening. You press hard enough to feel past the surface. Young Warren kneeling beside him, mimicking the posture palm, flat against October earth, still holding September's rain. How hard, all your weight, not pushing, just letting gravity do the work. Feel for temperature change. Cool means moisture. Moisture means clay's doing its job. James moving his hand in a grid pattern, pressing and releasing, building knowledge through sensation that no gauge or sensor could provide. Iron wheels punch through top layers. Rubber spreads. Weight stays on top. Different tools work different ground. Your job's knowing which ground you've got. Back in the present, Warren stood and wiped dirt from his hands. Cody had been watching from near the Deere phone held up recording. The kid looked confused, but intrigued, clearly not understanding what he'd witnessed. Warren walked back to the case and opened the toolbox. The hand-forged wrench lay exactly where it always had, iron gone dark with age and oil. His father had made this tool in the 1940s when commercial wrenches didn't fit the case's non-standard differential housing. The curve of the handle matched James's grip, worn smooth by decades of use. Warren carried the wrench to the rear axle and knelt beside the differential. The housing was original 1915 engineering designed when limited slip differentials meant mechanical sprag clutches rather than electronic management. A pin ran through the center of the differential carrier, held in place by a threaded collar. Rotating that collar 90 degrees locked both rear wheels together, eliminating any power loss to differential slippage. James had done this twice in competition. 1971 after losing to newer equipment, then 1989 when ground conditions matched what he was testing. Both times, the lock had made the difference between winning and losing because it changed the fundamental relationship between power and traction. The wrench fit into a slot. Most people wouldn't even see a modification James had made after losing that 1971 pull. He'd sworn never to need it again, but he'd built the capability anyway, because preparation mattered more than pride. Warren inserted the wrench and applied steady pressure. The collar resisted decades of vibration, having settled it into position. He increased force, gradually feeling for the give that would come when metal finally surrendered. The collar turned 90 degrees. Click! Both rear wheels were now locked together, receiving equal power regardless of which one had better traction. The change was mechanical, absolute, immune to electronic failure or computer error. A solution older than anyone watching this competition, built on principles that predated digital anything. Warren set the wrench back in the toolbox and climbed onto the case. His hands moved to the boiler controls, checking pressure that had settled at 128 during the break. Adequate for normal operation, but round 3 wouldn't be normal operation. His eyes moved to the red valve. The tape marking it had faded from repeated exposure to steam heat, but the words written below in James's hand remained legible. If you knew to look only when it matters. J.M. 1967. Another memory, this one from Warren's 14th summer. The barn on a June afternoon, sunlight slanting through siding gaps. James standing beside the case with tools spread across the workbench, installing something Warren didn't recognize. What's that do? Bypasses the pressure governor, lets the boiler run all the way to peak capacity. Warren watching his father work, not understanding why you'd want to bypass a safety system. Isn't the governor there to protect the seams? It is. This valve's for emergencies, situations where you need everything the machine can give and you're willing to risk the consequences. James tightening the final fitting, checking it twice. But every time you use it, you stress metal that's already carrying decades of fatigue. Seams might hold, might not. That's why you save it for when the stakes are real. How do you know when stakes are real? James had looked at him then with an expression Warren would spend decades learning to interpret. You'll know, and when you do, you'll understand why I'm installing this, even though I hope you never need it. Warren's hand touched the red valve, but didn't open it yet. Not until the flag dropped. Not until he'd committed completely to what came next. Around him, the fairground had reached peak attendance. Families filled every available spot along the rope barriers. The VIP section held local dignitaries and fair sponsors. Kenneth Harrison among them, still on his phone, still not watching what was happening 20 yards away. Blake sat in the Deere's cab, running through pre-pull checks, hands moving across touchscreens and physical controls, with the confidence of someone who trusted their equipment absolutely. The machine represented modern agriculture's pinnacle, everything that engineering and computer science could combine to maximize power and efficiency. The case represented something harder to quantify. Durability, accumulated knowledge, the particular kind of excellence that came from understanding a single thing completely rather than many things adequately. Ron walked to the center marker. The megaphone crackled. Round 3, final round. Winner takes the match. The crowd noise built toward something physical, sound pressure that made the air feel denser. Warren's pulse was steady despite everything, his hands calm on controls. He could have operated blindfolded. Rachel stood at the fence looking like she was watching someone walk toward a cliff edge. Ed leaned against a post with the stillness of men who'd seen enough competitions to know when something significant was approaching. Ron raised the flag high enough to catch every eye. Blake's throttle was already climbing, engine, note-deepening computer systems priming for maximum effort. Warren's hand rested on the regulator, holding pressure at 130, waiting for the moment when everything would change. The flag fell. Blake's move came with surgical precision, smooth application of full power. The traction control distributed force across optimized contact patches, 620 horsepower, delivered through rubber, designed by engineers who'd spent careers studying friction coefficients. The chain went rigid with a crack that echoed off the barn walls 200 yards distant. The case shuddered. Warren felt the impact through the iron seat, through his spine, through every part of him that was connected to this machine. The rear wheels pressed into dirt with force that made the ground compress, but they didn't turn backward. Warren opened the regulator to 140 in a single smooth motion. Steam flooded the cylinder. The flywheel accelerated, and then, with deliberate certainty, he opened the red valve. The boiler's tone changed immediately, a deeper note in the exhaust that spoke of reserves being tapped. Pressure climbed past 140, past 145, toward 150. The needle approached the red mark that James had painted there in 1967 as the absolute upper limit of what the seams could handle. Warren held it exactly there. No further. His hand on the regulator, reading the machine the way you read a language you'd spent 60 years learning. The differential lock meant every pound of torque reached both wheels simultaneously. No slippage, no loss to mechanical advantage. 100% of force divided equally, applied completely, wasted on nothing. Blake's traction control was doing the same thing electronically, reading and adjusting in milliseconds. But electronic systems reacted after slip began. The mechanical lock didn't react at all. It simply never allowed the slip to exist in the first place. Raw physics, raw iron, a solution already old when Kenneth Harrison was learning to walk. The case's wheels stopped any backward rotation they'd started. They didn't spin seeking grip. They pressed into earth with the patience of metal that had been working ground for 111 years, that knew only one way to approach resistance. The iron cleats punched through 2 inches of dry surface pack, hit the clay layer beneath where moisture from 4 days ago still lived. Found purchase in soil that held together, that gave the cleats something real to grip. The chain changed direction, not dramatically at first, not with the explosive force of sudden dominance, just one link of movement, then another, then the center marker beginning its migration away from Warren toward Blake, crossing the neutral zone with the unhurried certainty of something that had already decided how this ended. Blake pushed the accelerator to absolute maximum. Black exhaust rolled from the stack in steady column. The rear tires, 8 psi of extra pressure, fresh rubber, computer-managed grip, found the hardpack and held it, but couldn't push deeper to where the moisture was. The GPS display flickered. The traction control cycled through adjustments faster than human tracking, searching for a response. The ground had stopped offering. The case didn't stop. 1 foot past center, 2 feet, 3 feet. The crowd had gone completely silent. 500 people watching physics demonstrate that power alone didn't determine outcome when knowledge entered the equation. 4 feet past center, 5 feet. Warren held the red valve open, held the pressure at 150, felt the boiler straining at tolerances its maker had built in when Woodrow Wilson was president. The seams held because James had maintained them perfectly, because Warren had maintained them perfectly, because 3 generations of care had accumulated into reliability that computers couldn't replicate. 6 feet, 7 feet. Blake's hands gripped the Deere's wheel, watching through windshield glass as an impossibility played out in front of him. His father in the VIP section had finally looked up from his phone, confusion crossing his face as he tried to understand what he was seeing. 8 feet, 9 feet. Ron's hand went up with the red flag, and then silence fell across the entire Millhaven County fairground, like something physical dropping from above. 2 full seconds of absolute quiet. No voices, no engines running at full power anymore because Warren had eased the red valve closed, bringing pressure back down to safe levels with the care of someone lowering a baby into a crib. No children calling out. Even the distant carnival rides seemed to have paused in respect or shock. The red flag stayed raised. Then sound returned, and it came from everywhere at once. From the people who'd believed this might be possible. From the people who'd doubted and been proven wrong. From the people who'd come just to watch something interesting and gotten something they'd remember for years. The roar built until it physically pushed against Warren's chest, louder than anything that Fairground had contained in Ron Hayes's 17 years of running this event. Warren sat on the iron seat of the 1915 case and didn't raise his arms in victory. Didn't stand to acknowledge the crowd, didn't turn to accept celebration. He reached forward and eased the steam valve down the rest of the way, slowly, carefully, the way you lower something precious. Let the boiler settle into its resting rhythm with the attention due to machines that had given everything you'd asked and survived the asking. The pressure gauge needle descended. 140, 130, 120, back to idle levels where the case could sit for hours without complaint, where seams wouldn't stress, where 111 years of operation could continue into whatever future waited. Blake remained in the Deere's cab, both hands on the wheel, looking through the windshield at the back of a 73-year-old man on a machine older than anyone alive. His jaw was tight. His expression carried something that might have been respect or might have been the beginning of understanding that everything he'd assumed about farming was incomplete. Cody stood beside the rear tires, mouth slightly open, phone still recording. The mechanic said nothing. Kenneth Harrison, in the VIP section, stared with the expression of someone whose entire framework for understanding reality had just shifted without permission. Ron lowered the flag and walked to where the chain lay slack between the two machines. Winner round 3 and match Warren Mitchell. The noise doubled. Someone's grandmother was crying. A man in his 50s who'd spent his whole life farming knelt by the case's rear wheel like he was at an altar. Children who didn't understand what they'd witnessed knew from adult reactions that something important had happened. Rachel had both hands over her mouth, tears streaming down her face. Ed was nodding slowly, lips moving in what might have been prayer or might have been him talking to James Mitchell across whatever distance separated the living from those who'd taught them everything that mattered. Warren took off his hat and held it in his lap. He looked down the pull lane at the ground the chain had crossed, at the marker that had moved from Blake's territory back to his own at the dirt that had told him what he needed to know if he'd been willing to listen. Makes you wonder how often we miss what's right beneath us because we're looking at screens instead of the ground. The thought settled without judgment, just observation about what gets lost when technology replaces touch, when data substitutes for sensation, when the fastest answer matters more than the correct one. Warren sat with his hat in his lap while 500 people processed what they'd seen, while Blake remained in his cab trying to understand what his $250,000 equipment hadn't been able to accomplish against iron and steam and knowledge that predated digital anything. The afternoon was just beginning, but the competition was over. What came next would determine whether this moment meant something beyond one old man proving a point nobody had asked him to prove. The first person over the fence was a boy who couldn't have been older than 9. Untied sneakers and a baseball cap worn backward, he ducked under the rope barrier before any adult could stop him and ran straight to the case's rear wheel. Stopped just short of iron, taller than his head, reached out one small hand and pressed his palm flat against metal, still radiating heat from the effort. He looked back at the crowd with an expression trying to process something that didn't fit inside the categories school had given him. Then his father was there, lifting the boy higher so he could touch the boiler itself, both of them standing beside a machine that had been working before their great-grandparents were born. That started the flood. Within 30 seconds, the pull lane transformed. People who'd been gripping rope barriers from outside now stood beside the case around it behind it. An older woman in a floral blouse who'd spent the morning in a folding chair near the concession stand was having her picture taken by her granddaughter beside the left rear wheel. Both of them grinning like they'd discovered something valuable. A farmer Warren recognized from the feed store, man in his 50s, with hands that spoke of decades hauling bales and fixing equipment, crouched beside the drive chain studying the differential lock. He shook his head slowly, not in disbelief, but recognition. The kind of shake that meant he'd seen something like this before long ago, and remembering it now carried weight. The people who'd laughed earlier were quiet, not embarrassed exactly, something more thoughtful. The particular quiet that settles when a thing you dismissed without consideration turns out to have been worth every bit of it. Ron's voice cut through via megaphone, though by this point everyone already knew. Winner, Warren Mitchell, 1915, Case Steam Tractor 2 rounds to 1. The trophy would be presented at the main stage at 4 o'clock, a modest wooden base with a bronze plate that would sit on a shelf and mean everything to exactly the right person and nothing to everyone else. But that was hours away. Right now, Warren sat on the iron seat, letting the boiler cool properly, pressure dropping degree by degree the way the machine needed, the way you couldn't rush without risking damage to seals that were already a century old. His hand rested on the regulator, his eyes stayed on the gauge. He was doing what he'd always done after a hard run, paying attention to the machine the way the machine had just paid attention to him. The crowd moved around him like water finding its level. He sat in the middle of all that noise and motion and was entirely still. Blake's crew had begun disconnecting the chain from the Deere's rear hitch. Cody worked quietly, efficiently, without the energy he'd carried that morning. The generator was switched off. The tablet went into a padded case. The work of packing up after losing had its own rhythm, methodical and subdued, each task completed without comment or hurry. Blake himself hadn't moved from the cab. He sat with one hand on the wheel, looking across the pull lane at nothing in particular. Through the tinted glass, his expression was unreadable, but his posture spoke of someone trying to process an outcome that hadn't appeared in any scenario he'd prepared for. Kenneth Harrison's Mercedes pulled up to the VIP section exit. Window rolled down, phone still pressed to his ear. He gestured toward Blake with impatience, visible even from 40 yards. Blake finally climbed down from the Deere, moved toward his father's car with steps that looked heavier than they should. Kenneth's mouth moved, words lost in distance, but the tone carrying clearly enough. Blake responded with something short. Kenneth's expression shifted toward dismissal. The Mercedes pulled away. Blake stood watching it go alone in a way that had nothing to do with how many people surrounded him. Cody approached cautiously, started to say something, stopped. The mechanic stayed back by the trailer, giving Blake space that might have been respect or might have been uncertainty about what to say when your boss just lost to equipment that predated the Great Depression. Warren had finished his post-run checks, pressure at 110 and dropping naturally, all seals holding, no leaks visible anywhere. The boiler had taken the stress of peak operation and survived it the way James had designed it to survive, with margins built for exactly this kind of demand. He climbed down from the iron seat, movements careful, because 73-year-old joints protested sudden motion. Rachel was there immediately, had been waiting for this moment. "Dad!" She wrapped her arms around him, without ceremony, held on long enough that Warren understood this wasn't about congratulations. This was about relief, about watching someone you loved risk something important and come through intact. "I'm fine, honey." I know you are." She pulled back, wiping her eyes with the back of one hand. "That was the most terrifying thing I've watched you do. And I've watched you deliver breech calves and handle stallions that wanted to kill you. Machine's built for this, always has been." "It's not the machine I was worried about." Ed appeared at Warren's shoulders with timing that suggested he'd been waiting for the right moment. His face carried satisfaction that went deeper than simple pleasure at a competition won. James would have been proud. That soil reading the differential lock timing on the red valve. You did it exactly the way he taught. Warren pulled the journal from the toolbox and held it up. Had good notes to work from. Notes only help if you understand what they're saying. Plenty of people could read that journal and never figure out what James was teaching. Ed looked at the case with the affection reserved for things that outlast the people who made them. 3 generations now. William bought her new in 1915. James ran her for 50 years. You've had her nearly 30. Machine's seen more farming than most families remember. The crowd had thinned slightly, but people still gathered near the case, parents pointing out details to children. Older farmers examining the mechanical systems with the interest of people who remembered when machines like this weren't antiques, but working equipment. Warren saw Blake standing alone near the Deere and felt something shift in his chest. Not pity exactly, more like recognition of what it meant to lose when you'd brought everything you had and discover it wasn't enough. He walked across the pull lane. Blake noticed him coming, straightened slightly. Up close, the younger man looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with physical effort. Warren extended his hand. "Good pull." Blake took it, his grip firm. "Mr. Mitchell." "Warren's fine." "Warren!" Blake glanced back at the Deere, then at the case. "I don't understand what happened. My machine has 10 times your horsepower, better traction management, modern engineering. The math should have been simple. Math was simple. Ground didn't care about math. Blake's forehead creased. What does that mean? Warren walked toward where round 3 had happened. Blake followed. They stopped at the spot where the case's rear wheels had made their stand, where cleats had punched through dry surface to find moisture below. Warren knelt and pressed his hand flat against the dirt. Try it. Press hard. Blake crouched beside him, mimicking the posture. His palm went flat against baked earth that had been worked smooth by 2 machines pulling against each other. What am I supposed to feel? Top 2 inches. Tell me what you notice. Dry. Hard-packed. Like concrete, almost. Now press harder. Put your weight into it. Not pushing, just letting gravity do the work. Blake shifted his weight forward, leaning into his palm. 30 seconds passed. His expression changed slightly. It's cooler, maybe 4 inches down. That's clay. Holds moisture from the rain we had 4 days back. Your tires stayed on top of this hard pack, spread the weight out across the surface. My iron wheels, they're heavier per square inch, and the cleats are designed to bite. We punched through. Blake sat back on his heels, looking at the ground like he was seeing it for the first time. The tire pressure increase. Made it worse for you. Less surface area trying to do the same job. Caught between not enough contact to grip the top layer and not enough weight to break through to the clay. I never thought about layers, just saw hard ground and adjusted for traction on hard surfaces. That's what the computer saw too, but computers read what's there. Can't read what's underneath unless you've got sensors telling them to look. And even then, sensors tell you what exists, don't tell you what it means. Warren stood his knees, protesting. Blake remained crouched, one hand still pressed against the earth, like he was trying to memorize something through touch. How did you know that the moisture was there? Same way my father knew, same way his father probably figured out. You press your hand to the ground in enough different conditions, enough different seasons. You start learning how temperature variation translates to soil composition below the surface. Blake finally stood brushing dirt from his palm. That's not in any agricultural engineering course I took. Different kind of knowledge. Not better or worse than what you learned, just different. Warren pulled the journal from his pocket, opened to the page with the pressed oak leaf. My father kept notes for 40 years. Soil conditions, weather patterns, how the case responded under different loads. Drew diagrams, made tables. This is data same as anything your computer collects, just recorded differently. Blake took the journal carefully, handled it like something that might break. He studied the hand-drawn sketches of soil layers, the moisture tables written in ink that had faded, but remained legible. This is remarkable. This is 40 years of field observations compiled into a reference anyone could use. If they understood what they were looking at, would you teach me some of this? The question hung between them. Warren had expected analysis, maybe grudging respect, possibly defensiveness. He hadn't expected Blake Harrison to ask for instruction from someone whose methods his father's entire operation had been designed to replace. You serious? I've got the best equipment money can buy, the newest technology, everything that modern agriculture says I should need to run a successful operation. Blake looked back at the Deere gleaming green paint catching afternoon sun. But I don't have what you have. Time and attention. 60 years of learning the same piece of ground well enough to read it by touch. Your father would probably have opinions about you learning from outdated methods. My father has opinions about everything I do. Most of them involve how I'm not measuring up to his expectations. Blake's voice carried the particular flatness of someone who'd stopped fighting a war they couldn't win. This isn't about him. This is about me understanding that I just lost to a machine from 1915 because I didn't know something fundamental about the ground I work." Warren considered. Teaching meant time, meant patience, meant finding words for things he mostly understood through accumulated experience rather than conscious articulation. But looking at Blake's face, seeing genuine interest rather than polite obligation, suggested the effort might mean something. "Tuesdays and Thursdays. I'm usually at the farm working on something. You're welcome to come by." Blake nodded slowly, something in his expression shifting from defeat toward possibility. "Thank you." They stood in afternoon sun that had climbed toward genuine heat. Around them, the fairground continued its noise and motion. Children on carnival rides screaming with manufactured fear. Food vendors calling out specials. The PA system announcing the next event in the livestock barn. But in this particular spot between two men separated by 42 years and completely different approaches to the same work, something had shifted. Not friendship exactly, more like the beginning of respect that might become something larger if given time and attention. Cody approached with the tablet saw. Warren hesitated. "It's fine, Cody. Come over." The kid held up his phone. "Mr. Mitchell, I recorded the whole thing, the soil, reading the wrench work on the differential everything. Would you mind if I posted it? My friends are never going to believe this without video." Warren shrugged. "Do what you want. Just don't make me look heroic. I'm too old for that nonsense." "No, sir. Just showing what happened." Cody looked at Blake. "Sir, if you're going to learn from Mr. Mitchell, could I maybe tag along sometimes? My grandfather used to talk about the old methods before he died. I'd like to understand what he meant." Blake glanced at Warren, who nodded. "Both of you. Tuesdays and Thursdays." Ed had drifted over during the conversation, listening without interrupting. Now he stepped forward. "Blake, your great-grandfather Patterson. You know who he was. My mother's grandfather sold his farm to my father 10 years ago." "That's right. Worked that land for 60 years before selling it. He and I were friends from the time we were kids." Ed pulled out his wallet, extracted a photograph gone soft at the edges from decades of carrying. "This is him and me, 1965, standing beside a farm-all tractor we'd rebuilt together." The photo showed two young men, maybe 25, grease-stained and grinning beside red machinery. Blake studied it with the expression of someone seeing ancestry they'd never been given access to. "I didn't know you knew him." "Knew him well. He was at Warren's father's pools. Watched James run this case in competitions across 3 counties. Used to tell me that modern farming was losing something important, but he could never quite explain what. Just felt it." Ed took the photo back, returned it to his wallet with care. "Your great-grandfather understood that you can't force ground to do what it doesn't want to do. You have to work with it, listen to what it's telling you. That knowledge got bred out of farming when corporations started treating land like production units instead of living systems." Blake absorbed this processing family history he'd never been told through the filter of what he'd just experienced. "Why didn't anyone teach me this? Why didn't my father or my grandfather or anyone in my family pass this down?" "Because your grandfather sold to Kenneth, and Kenneth saw farming as business rather than craft. Nothing wrong with that necessarily. Business puts food on tables, keeps operations running. But something gets lost when profit's the only metric that matters." Rachel had been standing back listening. Now she moved forward. "Blake, I'm Rachel Mitchell, Warren's daughter." They shook hands. "I watched you work today, watched you analyze what went wrong and adapt between rounds. That's good farming using tools to solve problems. My father does the same thing just with different tools. Tools from a century ago. Tools that still work when you understand them completely. Modern doesn't mean better, just different. Old doesn't mean obsolete, just proven. Rachel glanced at her father. Took me until today to really understand what he's been protecting all these years, not just a machine or a farm. A way of seeing the world that my generation barely remembers existed. In that moment, something Warren had been carrying without naming it came clear. This wasn't about beating Blake Harrison or proving steam could compete with diesel. This was about demonstrating that knowledge accumulated slowly across generations held value that technology couldn't replace, only complement. The machines weren't the point. The machines were just the medium through which understanding got tested. Blake's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, expression tightening. My father, asking where I am. You should go. Yeah. Blake pocketed the phone without responding to the message. But I'll be there Tuesday. Your farm. What time? Whenever you show up. Blake headed toward his truck, Cody falling in beside him to help pack equipment. Ed watched them go with the satisfaction of someone who'd planted seeds and was already seeing the first green shoots. That boy's got potential, just needs teaching that Kenneth won't provide. Warren moved back to the case, began the process of preparing it for transport home. The crowd had mostly dispersed, drawn toward other attractions. The pull lane would host more competitions tomorrow, tractors of various makes and models, but none of them would carry the weight of what had happened this afternoon. Ron appeared with the trophy hours early, but understanding that some presentations didn't need ceremony. Thought you might want this before the official thing at 4. The trophy was exactly what Warren had expected. Wooden base, brass plate, engraved with his name and the competition details. The kind of award that meant nothing to anyone except the person who earned it through effort nobody else had to exert. Appreciate it, Ron. 17 years I've run this fair. Never seen anything like what you did today. Hell, never even imagined it was possible. Machines built well, that's all. Machines one part, knowledge is the other. You showed 500 people that old methods still work when you understand them. Ron clapped Warren on the shoulder, headed back toward the main stage. Warren set the trophy in the case's toolbox beside his father's journal. 2 objects that would outlast him, would carry meaning forward even after the person who'd created that meaning was gone. Rachel helped him secure the tarp over the case, both of them working in the practiced silence of people who'd done this together before. The afternoon was aging toward evening heat, finally breaking as shadows lengthened across the fairground. You hungry, I'll buy you dinner in town. I could eat. They drove to Millhaven's Diner, a place that had occupied the same corner since 1952 and served food that hadn't changed its recipes since Kennedy was president. Took a booth by the window, ordered coffee and the Saturday special without looking at menus they'd both memorized years ago. The waitress, a woman named Margaret who'd been working there longer than Rachel had been alive, brought coffee and looked at Warren with new eyes. Heard what you did at the fair. Beat that Harrison boy with your daddy's old tractor. News travels. In this county faster than weather. She filled their cups. Your father would have been proud. James was a good man, taught half the farmers in this county how to maintain equipment before throwing it away became cheaper than fixing it. She moved to the next table. Warren added sugar to his coffee, watching granules dissolve and disappear. Rachel wrapped both hands around her cup. What happens now? You won. You proved what you wanted to prove. What's next? Same as before. Maintain the farm, keep the case running, Wait for Tuesdays and Thursdays to see if Blake actually shows up, or if today was just emotion talking. You think he'll come? I think he's looking for something his father can't give him. Whether he finds it on my farm or somewhere else, that's his choice. Their food arrived. They ate quietly, both too tired for extended conversation. Outside the window, Mill Haven's main street carried light. Saturday evening traffic. Pickup trucks and sedans. People heading home after the fair or toward the bars that would fill up once true night arrived. Warren's phone buzzed, a text from a number he didn't recognize. "This is Blake Harrison. Thank you for today. I'll see you Tuesday morning." Warren showed Rachel the screen. She smiled. "He's coming." "Looks that way." They finished dinner as the sun touched the horizon, painting Missouri sky in colors that looked computer-generated in their intensity. Warren paid the check despite Rachel's protest, left Margaret a tip that made her eyebrows climb, and headed back to the farm. The barn doors rolled open on their familiar tracks. Warren backed the flatbed in and loaded the case with the same care he'd used loading it that morning. The machine rolled into its usual spot iron wheels, settling into depressions they'd worn over decades of parking in this exact location. He removed the trophy from the toolbox, carried it inside the house, set it on the kitchen counter beside the window where morning light would hit it first thing. Stood looking at it for a long moment, seeing not the brass and wood, but what they represented. Then he made a phone call. Blake answered on the second ring. "Mr. Mitchell." "Warren, listen, Tuesday's fine for learning soil reading, but if you're serious about this, bring a notebook. We're going to cover a lot of ground." "I'll be there. 8 o'clock. "That works." Warren ended the call, looked out the window at his 80 acres stretching toward darkness. This land had been Mitchell property for 90 years. His grandfather had worked it with horses, his father with the case, and later diesel tractors. Warren with whatever tools made sense for the job at hand. Now maybe Blake Harrison would learn to work it too, combining old knowledge with new technology in ways that honored both. The future wasn't guaranteed. Blake might lose interest. Kenneth might forbid the lessons. 100 different things could interfere. But for right now, in this moment, possibility existed where none had been that morning. Warren turned off the kitchen light and headed upstairs, his body protesting stairs that felt steeper than they used to. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. Tonight, he'd sleep with the satisfaction of someone who'd done something difficult and done it right. 6 weeks later, January cold bit through Warren's barn coat as he stood in the workshop showing Blake how to hand-forge a replacement pin for the case's differential. The metal glowed orange in the propane forge, radiating heat that barely kept the workshop above freezing. Blake held the hammer, bringing it down with the rhythm Warren had taught him. Strike, rotate, strike. The pin was taking shape, rough still, but recognizable. "More on the taper. Needs to seat flush, or it'll work loose." Blake adjusted his angle, focused with the concentration of someone learning that precision mattered more than force. This was his 8th visit. Every Tuesday since the fair, 8 o'clock sharp, showing up with his notebook and questions that had evolved from basic to sophisticated. The transformation had been gradual, but unmistakable. Blake's initial interest, rooted in defeat, had grown into genuine curiosity about methods his education had never covered. He'd brought soil samples from his operation for Warren to analyze by hand, comparing Warren's assessments against lab results. The old method had been accurate within acceptable margins, proving you could read what scientific instruments measured if you'd trained your senses properly. Rachel stopped by weekend visits now, sometimes staying to watch the lessons, sometimes just checking that her father hadn't overextended himself. She'd started learning too, asking questions about the case's maintenance schedule, helping with routine checks, building knowledge she could carry forward. The pin finished taking shape. Blake quenched it in oil, watched steam rise as metal cooled and hardened. "Your father teach you this?" "James taught me everything that mattered. Some things I've figured out myself, but the foundation came from him." Warren examined the pin, nodded approval. "Good work. That'll hold." Blake set the pin aside to cool completely, wiped his hands on a shop rag. "I used your soil reading method on the South 40 last month. Adjusted our irrigation schedule based on what I found about moisture layers. Saved water and got better coverage. Results matter more than method." Kenneth noticed, asked how I'd improved efficiency. I told him I learned from you. Blake's expression suggested this conversation hadn't gone smoothly. He wasn't pleased, called it backwards thinking, but he couldn't argue with the yield data. Warren poured coffee from a thermos, handed Blake a cup. "Your father sees farming as business. Nothing wrong with that. But business metrics don't capture everything that matters." "I'm starting to understand that." Blake sipped coffee, grimaced at the temperature. "The other day, I was out checking the north sections, and I just, stopped. Put my hand on the ground like you taught me. Felt the moisture gradient, the temperature variation. And for the first time since I started farming, I felt connected to the land instead of just managing it." This was the kind of statement Warren had learned not to push. Let Blake articulate what he was discovering at his own pace in his own words. The journey from viewing land as production unit to understanding it as living system couldn't be rushed. Cody's truck pulled into the driveway, the kid arriving for his regular Thursday afternoon session. He'd been coming almost as faithfully as Blake, absorbing knowledge with the eagerness of someone who recognized opportunity when it appeared. He bounded into the workshop with energy that made Warren feel exhausted just watching. "Mr. Mitchell, I tried that hand pressure technique on my uncle's property. Found a wet spot he didn't know existed. Helped him reroute drainage and probably saved his foundation." "Good application." Cody pulled out his phone, showed a photo of himself and his uncle beside newly installed drainage pipes. "He wants to know if you'd come by sometime, teach him what you taught me." Warren hesitated. Teaching 2 people was manageable. Opening this to wider circulation meant commitment he wasn't sure he wanted to make. Blake spoke up. "What if we formalized it? Not a big thing, just, monthly sessions at the feed store or something. Farmers who want to learn old methods alongside modern techniques." "I'm 73, not looking to start a teaching career." "Not a career, just sharing what you know before it's gone." Blake set down his coffee. "That journal your father kept, that's 60 years of knowledge. You've added 30 more, 90 years of observations about this county's soil weather patterns, seasonal variations. That's not something we can afford to lose." Warren looked at the case, visible through the workshop door, at the journal sitting on the workbench, at 2 young men who'd shown up wanting to learn things schools didn't teach anymore. "Let me think about it." They worked for another hour. Blake and Cody both practicing techniques that required patience rather than power. Forge work tool maintenance, the careful attention to detail that separated adequate from excellent. As they were packing up to leave, Blake pulled an envelope from his jacket. "Almost forgot. My mother wanted you to have this." Inside was a photograph, black and white, creased from years of storage. 2 men standing beside a steam tractor, both young, both grinning despite obvious exhaustion. The caption on the back read, Edward Patterson and James Mitchell, County Fair, 1965, second place. Warren stared at the image of his father, decades younger, arm around Ed's shoulder, both of them covered in grease and satisfaction. Where'd she find this? Going through her grandfather's things. She remembered you and thought you might want it. Warren's throat tightened. He hadn't seen this photo in probably 40 years, might have forgotten it existed. But here was evidence that the work he'd watched his father do had mattered to people beyond family, that lessons passed down had value worth preserving. Thank her for me. Blake and Cody left as afternoon light started failing. Warren stayed in the workshop looking at the photograph, thinking about James and Ed, and all the knowledge that had flowed between generations of farmers who understood that the land outlasted the people who worked it. Rachel's Subaru appeared right on schedule for her weekly visit. She came into the workshop carrying groceries Warren hadn't asked for, but would accept because arguing about it had proven futile. "You look thoughtful." He showed her the photograph. "Blake's mother found this. Your grandfather and Ed, 1965. Rachel studied the image, seeing her grandfather as a young man for probably the first time. "He looks happy." He was. "This was the year he taught me to really run the case. I was 12, thought I knew everything. He spent 6 months teaching me I knew nothing." Warren set the photo carefully on the workbench. "Blake wants me to start teaching sessions, monthly things at the feed store for farmers who want to learn old methods. What do you think about that?" "I think I'm tired and old and not interested in becoming some kind of agricultural historian. But maybe he's right that this knowledge shouldn't die with me. Your grandfather didn't keep that journal just for himself. He documented everything so it could be passed forward." Rachel unpacked groceries, putting things in their usual places through long familiarity with her father's kitchen. "So do it. Not every week, not some huge commitment. Just once a month share what you know. Let people decide if it's useful." The idea settled with less resistance than Warren expected. Once a month, 2 hours. Nothing formal, just demonstrations and discussion for anyone interested. If 10 people showed up, fine. If nobody came, that would answer the question about whether this mattered. "I'll talk to Ron about using the community barn." "Good." Rachel finished with the groceries, turned to face him. "Dad, what you did at the fair, that wasn't just about winning a competition. You showed people that old knowledge still works. That experience counts for something. Now finish what you started by making sure that knowledge doesn't vanish." She was right. The pull had been about proving a point. But the point was incomplete if he kept the lessons to himself. Warren called Ron that evening, explained what he was thinking. Ron immediately offered the fairgrounds community barn first Saturday of each month, no charge whatever Warren needed. The first session happened 4 weeks later. Warren arrived expecting maybe a dozen people. Found 40 farmers, young and old, sitting on hay bales waiting for him to start. He taught them soil reading first, had everyone go outside, press hands to frozen ground, feel for the temperature variation that indicated where snowmelt would drain come spring. Some people got it immediately. Others needed more practice, but everyone tried, and that was enough. Blake attended with Cody. Kenneth Harrison did not, which surprised nobody. But several other corporate farm managers showed up quietly, interested in supplementing their technology with traditional knowledge. By the third session, attendance had grown to 60. By the sixth, Warren had to start limiting enrollment because the barn couldn't safely hold more than 80 people. News traveled, Agricultural journals sent reporters. A graduate student from the state university requested permission to document the sessions for his thesis on traditional farming techniques. Warren agreed to everything with the bemused acceptance of someone who'd lived 74 years and thought he understood how his story would end, only to discover new chapters kept appearing. The case sat in Warren's barn, maintained, but no longer competing. The 2026 fair came and went without Warren entering. He'd proven what needed proving. What mattered now was making sure the lessons outlasted the teacher. Blake's operation had become something neither fully traditional nor completely modern, a hybrid approach that used GPS and soil sensors alongside hand reading and seasonal observation. His yields increased. More importantly, his relationship with the land shifted from management to partnership. Kenneth never acknowledged the change, never admitted that his son had found something valuable in methods the corporate model had discarded. But Kenneth's approval had stopped being the point, somewhere between August and January, replaced by Blake's own growing certainty that he was finally farming rather than just operating equipment. On a Tuesday in late March, Warren stood in the workshop teaching Blake and Cody how to read boiler pressure by sound rather than gauge training their ears to detect the subtle variations that indicated when steam flow needed adjustment. Blake held a hand near the case's relief valve, eyes closed, listening to the rhythm Warren was describing. "There, you hear that? The interval between releases. Yeah, it's steady, about every 3 seconds. Now watch the gauge while you're listening. See how the pressure correlates to the sound pattern." Blake opened his eyes, checking the needle position against what his ears had registered. If the interval shortens, pressure's climbing. If it lengthens, pressure's dropping. Right. Gauges fail. Ears don't if you've trained them. Your great-grandfather Patterson knew this. Ed knows it. Now you know it too. The knowledge passed forward one more time, carried by people who understood that farming done well required every tool available, old and new, mechanical and biological, measured and felt. In a world racing forward, what wisdom are we leaving behind? And what could we gain by slowing down long enough to listen to those who remember how to read what we've stopped seeing? The question wasn't rhetorical. Every farmer who attended Warren's sessions was answering it through their presence, through their willingness to learn methods their education had skipped, through their recognition that technology enhanced rather than replaced understanding. Warren was 74 now. The case was 112. James's journal had been expanded by Warren's own notes observations from 30 years of working the same ground his father and grandfather had worked. Someday, Rachel would inherit all of it, would decide what to preserve and what to let fade. But for now, on this Tuesday morning, with Blake learning to listen and Cody taking notes, and the workshop warm from the forge's heat, the knowledge flowed forward the way it always had, hand to hand, generation to generation, the particular kind of wealth that increased the more you gave it away. Blake's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, smiled. "My mother. She wants to know if you'd have dinner with her and Ed sometime. She's got more photos of her grandfather and your father's stories she thinks you'd want to hear." Warren considered. His social calendar consisted mostly of Rachel's visits and teaching sessions. Adding dinner with Blake's mother and Ed would break routine. But routine existed to serve life, not the other way around. Tell her yes. Outside the workshop window, Warren's 80 acres stretched toward spring planting. The soil was thawing, preparing for another season of growth and harvest. The same soil Warren's grandfather had worked, his father had worked, Warren had worked, and now Blake was learning to work not through inheritance, but through choice. That mattered. The choosing, the decision that knowledge from 1915 held value in 2026 if you were willing to learn it properly. Warren shut down the forge, let the fire die to coals that would extinguish themselves by evening. Blake and Cody packed up their notes, promised to return Thursday. After they left, Warren walked out to the barn and stood beside the case, ran his hand along the boiler's curved surface, feeling metal that had survived 112 years through care and attention and respect for what well-made things could accomplish if maintained properly. The trophy from the fair sat on a shelf in the house brass plate, catching morning light. But the real trophy stood here in this barn, built before World War I, still capable of the work it was designed for, still teaching lessons to anyone willing to learn. Warren locked the barn and headed inside as evening settled across Missouri farmland. Tomorrow would bring another day of teaching, another group of farmers wanting to understand what their great-grandparents knew and what corporate agriculture had forgotten. The work would continue, the knowledge would spread, and somewhere in the future, people Warren would never meet would press their hands to soil and feel what lay beneath the surface, because someone had shown them how to read what screens couldn't measure. Have you ever learned something from an older person that changed how you see the world? Something that couldn't come from a book or a screen? Share your story in the comments. I'd love to hear it.